Cantor, thanks for the kind words and thanks for the welcome back. As she mentioned, this is my first Shabbat back at Temple after returning from sabbatical just a few days ago. If you didn't know that I've been gone for 3 months, I'm here to tell you, you should come to Temple more often. So over the weeks ahead, I'm looking forward to sharing with you some stories about how I spent my time while I was away, both at home in Houston and in a few other places around the world, things I did and the things that I learned. And tonight I want to share just one small story about one of the things that I discovered while I was participating in a Jewish heritage tour of Portugal in December. As part of the tour, I visited a small town in northeastern Portugal called Belmonte. Belmonte was first settled centuries ago by the Romans, who were drawn there by its rich minerals and its fertile fields for agriculture. Over the years, Belmonte continued to grow and thrive, eventually swelling in the 13th century with a large Jewish population that lived side by side with their Catholic neighbors. At the end of the 15th century, however, as we know, the Inquisition forced all of Spain's Jews into exile, and the Jews of Portugal were subjected to a prolonged campaign of extraordinary oppression, including widespread torture and forced conversions. The years of persecution led to the development of an extensive crypto-Jewish community in Belmonte, an underground community of those who represented themselves to the outside world as converted Catholics, but who remained secretly Jewish, continuing to observe Jewish life surreptitiously in the privacy of their homes. What was remarkable is that Belmonte's crypto-Jews maintained the secret of their Jewishness for centuries. Long after the Inquisition had ended, they continued walling themselves off from the rest of the Jewish world, maintaining the traditions through the generations of their families, but never revealing themselves publicly. Listen to this, it wasn't until the end of the 19th century that the Jews of Belmonte learned that they weren't the only Jews in the world. And they discovered other Jewish communities in Europe and around the world. Only in about 1970 did the Portuguese crypto-Jews begin reconnecting with the global Jewish community and finally felt comfortable bringing their Jewish lives and their Jewish identity out of the shadows and into the sunlight of public life. Today, Jewish life has returned fully to Belmonte. There is a synagogue there, which you can reach by winding your way through twisting cobblestone streets, past quaint red-roofed houses and scrawny alley cats with hungry eyes. And there's a Jewish museum there, too, where you can explore artifacts and texts that testify to the long and complicated history of Jews in northeastern Portugal. Now, one of the items in the museum's holdings is this: a decoratively carved piece of ivory about the size of a man's thumb. On the bottom, as you can see, there's a removable sliding cover which conceals a small internal compartment. I'll give you a second to try to guess what this object is, and I will give you a hint. Every Jewish family in Belmonte had one. It is a crypto-Jewish mezuzah. What makes this mezuzah different from the ones that we have on our homes or on the doors of our synagogues is that, for obvious reasons, during the Inquisition and during the years of anti-Jewish persecution that followed, it would have been unimaginable for a Jewish family to publicize its Jewishness by hanging a mezuzah on the door, something that would be immediately visible to church authorities. So the Jews of Belmonte came up with an innovative solution: a small, unobtrusive, portable mezuzah that the man of the house would carry in his pocket every single day, in observance of the commandment to carry God's words with us when we stay at home and when we are away, when we lie down and when we rise up. Even during times of difficulty and oppression, they carried their mezuzahs in secret, keeping them close in a pocket to remind them of who they were and what was expected of them. Now notice also that on the other end, the top of the mezuzah is rounded. I don't think this is a coincidence. I think it is meant to remind us of the shape of the tablets of the commandments, the fundamental guiding principles of Jewish life, which the Jews of Belmonte pledged to fulfill with all their heart, with all their soul, and with all their might. This week, the Torah describes a dramatic scene that took place at the base of Mount Sinai, while at the same time at the top of the mountain, Moses was receiving the tablets of the law. The children of Israel were encamped in the foothills, basking in the glow of revelation that took place when God's voice rang out and the covenant of Torah was born. God's commandments imprinted on their hearts and engraved on those two tablets made of stone. It was a magnificent moment, but once it passed, things went differently than Moses had imagined they would. Rather than seeing his people wholeheartedly transformed into a nation of laws and covenant with their God, after Moses has lingered at the peak of the mountain, he descends to the Israelite camp and finds them dancing around a golden calf, worshiping that glittering idol of gold. How could they do that? How could they betray their promises so soon after accepting the covenant with God? When I ask that question, I think now about the Jews of Belmonte who kept the laws and stayed faithful to the commandments of Judaism through centuries of extraordinary oppression. How could the Israelites at Sinai betray those same promises after less than a month and a half? How could that be? Well, our medieval commentaries offer a surprisingly mundane answer to this question. They tell us that the sin of the golden calf took place because of a glitch with the calendar. They explain it this way. Moses promised the people that he would return from the mountain after staying at the summit for 40 days. But the people misunderstood him. They thought he said he would be back after 40 days total, not considering the time it would take for him to travel to the top of the mountain and come back again afterward. Their failure to account for Moses' travel time meant that he returned to the camp a day later than when they expected him home. Moses being delayed by a single day drove the Israelites into such a fearful panic that they couldn't go on. They were so terrified by the thought that they had been abandoned by their leader that they were willing to undo the covenant and return to the worship of idols. It's not that the Jews of Belmonte were made of sterner stuff than the generation of the golden calf. It's just that they had adjusted their expectations in ways that would sustain their faith rather than undermine it. Even through years of persecution, they expected that they would suffer at the hands of the Inquisition. And so when they did, although their injuries were grievous, they were not surprising. The Israelites, on the other hand, weren't capable of this sort of religious imagination. So when their expectations were violated, it led to that most atrocious and insubordinate disobedience of God's law. From this perspective, the story of the golden calf isn't really a story about idolatry. It's a story about fear. It's a story about what happens when people are stunted by anxiety, agonized by dread. Moses' absence stretched on longer than they had expected, and the critical breakdown in the Israelites' faith led them to an idol which could not bring them comfort or peace. A couple of centuries ago, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov used to teach that all human suffering emerges in one way or another from being afraid of things we don't need to be afraid of. It's a challenging and provocative teaching, and it's one I'm not entirely sure I agree with, but to be honest, it offers us quite a bit to think about. Because what I do believe is true is that when we turn our eyes today to the story of our people, trembling and alone at the foot of Mount Sinai, we can imagine easily how they felt. We can empathize with them. We can feel their fear because we know too how it feels to be frightened, to be anxious and uncertain. And when we do that, when we look back at our ancestors through the pages of the Torah, we also see so clearly the obvious truth that they were unable to see. They didn't have to be afraid. All they had to do was wait one more day. I'll tell you that I find great comfort in that. When I feel afraid, when I am gripped by dread and nervousness and fear, I think of them. And I ask myself what maybe we should all ask ourselves before we panic, before we do anything rash or impulsive or regrettable. Can we wait a day? Can we wait one more day? And if the answer is yes, then tomorrow we'll ask ourselves the same question. The story of the golden calf ultimately has a happy ending. There's a redemptive epilogue that comes a chapter later in the Bible. Moses intercedes with God on the people's behalf, and God agrees to spare them. And the Israelites are allowed to continue forward on their journey toward the promised land, God promising to carry them there as on eagle's wings, lifting us up lovingly and carrying us home like a mezuzah in a pocket of the divine. And on our way, what we carry matters too. What can we tuck into our pockets that will let us feel left alone, less vulnerable, less afraid? And conversely, what might we be carrying that it's time for us to put down? What are we lugging around day after day that makes us feel smaller and less powerful than we should? It's not the case that there's nothing to be afraid of. It would be foolish to deny that. Our world today is torn by war and violence and cruelty and hatred. We have good reason to be frightened, to feel worried about our brothers and sisters in Israel, about our American service members stationed in vulnerable places overseas. The prayers that we send toward them are powered by equal measures of love and anxiety. But we can't let that anxiety, we can't let that fear to hold paralyzing power over us. If we can't banish it altogether, if we can't shrug off our fear completely, maybe we can just try to do what the Israelites needed to do in those dark desert foothills thousands of years ago. Turn our eyes to God and resolve to wait one more day. Like our ancestors before us, we are on a journey, each of us in our own way, through uncertain terrain that we pray will give way to a place of promise, expansiveness, and ease. And things will frighten us along the way. That is certain, but our mission, our religious imperative as Jews, is not to be immobilized by the things that scare us. So let this be our commitment and our promise, that when life challenges and confounds us, we will not be frozen by fear, but open to the awesome potential of goodness, moved to take a deep breath, to give ourselves permission to wait one more day for redemption to arrive. Let this be God's will. Ken Yehi Ratzon. Shabbat Shalom.